Good morning and a warm welcome to today's launch of this year's SONAR 2022 report on emerging risk insights. I must say this feels like an apposite time to be discussing emerging risks. My name is Anthony Kennaway and I'm the Head of Public Affairs and Stakeholder Dialogue here at Swiss Re. We'll get the event underway in just a second, but before we start, just a couple of administrative points. Firstly, over the next 30 to 40 minutes, we'll be having the dialogue and the discussion. And after that, we will be able to move to questions from you, the audience. If you have a question, obviously in the room, please just raise your hand and a microphone will come to you. And if you have a question online, please just hit the Microsoft Q&A button at the top of the screen and you'll be able to ask your question. Those questions will be moderated. It will take a moment or two to appear, but please just ask your question. And finally, for privacy reasons, I should remind you that this event is being live streamed publicly and will be published online and on the SONAR web pages. With that, let me hand over to the sponsor of our SONAR team, the sponsor of the SONAR report, and our Group Chief Risk Officer, Patrick Rafflab. Patrick, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Anthony, for the introduction, and good morning, and a warm welcome from my side as well to this actually 10-year anniversary publishing event of the SONAR report. Now, we've been working on emerging risks in a systematic way longer than 10 years, but 10 years ago we decided to actually publish this SONAR report, so it marks an anniversary, and I'll get back to that. Our conviction has been that sharing emerging risk insights and stimulating dialogue about it, about emerging risks, will actually increase our understanding and of potential risks that could face us, society, but also the insurance industry. The SONAR aim is not to try and predict or forecast. It is really rather the attempt is to push our thinking and to basically raising our awareness and make us better prepared for what could come, rather than try to be very specifically prepared for a specific prediction. So the relevant question is not could we have seen this coming, but probably rather could we have been better prepared. The 10th anniversary of SONAR publication comes at a time when the world is still in a state of shock and crisis. Most immediately, obviously, the war in Ukraine and the death and destruction that this is causing. The conflict has also polarized the world further and itself comes in the wake of a still ongoing pandemic. At the same time, global warming remains a long-term and existential threat, and the world needs to take more collaborative action now to transition to climate-friendly economies and away from fossil fuel dependency. Over the last 10 years of publishing the report, we have had some successes, but also our fair share of reminders that emerging risks are dynamic, sometimes unpredictable, and therefore constantly challenge ourselves and our thinking and our preparation. For example, the risk of infectious diseases in the form of pandemics, but also microbial threat cluster has been featured in the SONAR report multiple times. There's 3, 4, 5 times, depending on how you count. Over the last 10 years, we have been identifying particular aspects of this sort of broad risk. So with the benefit of hindsight, we can say certainly these are topics, or have become topics of great relevance, and the world was warned. But also, we can say that the society as a whole, but also the insurance industry, could have been better prepared, especially for particularly for the severe lockdowns and the economic and business consequences that this triggered. Looking over the past decade of publishing SONAR, probably perhaps two key observations come to mind. The first is that increasingly complex, dynamic, interconnected, fast-moving risks require us to be risk-aware more than ever. Here, the insurance industry actually has an important role to play, not just as a bearer of risk, as a risk carrier and financial shock absorber, but equally importantly, as contributing to risk knowledge, raising awareness, and also signaling adequate cost of the risk or risk pricing. This is particularly important considering my second observation, which is the need for a greater focus on long-term developing risks, or slower burning, as we call them, risks, that are important and urgent, but oftentimes go unnoticed because they hide under the radar of the most current, most pertinent worry. Of course, it's obvious to compare, to illustrate this, to compare the recent pandemic with one of the three macro trends that we consider in SONAR. One of which, the most significant one, actually being climate change. So the pandemic was both important, urgent, and required immediate attention. By contrast, the risks associated with climate change are slower burning and not yet presenting risk clusters in all instances as immediately and urgently as the pandemic did. Unfortunately, if we don't act now and in collaboration, impacts of climate change might very well actually exceed both the human and economic toll of the pandemic in the future. Successful transition to net zero emissions by 2050 demand short-term and mid-term target setting, concrete climate actions, and progress monitoring. It will also be necessary to manage potential risks and unintended consequences of the transition. Decarbonization is easier for some industries than others, and in many cases, reducing emissions must be balanced with other targets for sustainability. To bring this more into focus, we will now delve into a few risk examples, and one is sustainable farming, so the risks and opportunities associated with sustainable farming in just a moment. In today's world, change is often driven by our second core theme of today, which is technological disruption. Change often also has societal impacts. These can be growing inequalities or shifting opportunities. Some transition risk will be mitigated by technological advances. Other technology can in turn actually also create new risk. Hence the title of our second deep dive topic today, quantum computing, a threat before an opportunity, hints to this. I'm delighted that we can now explore two of these topics, the sustainable farming and quantum computing, which we have covered in the latest report with two eminent experts. And I'm also pleased to introduce Anne Lobeck, who is Swiss Re's Head of Global Specialty, to the podium, and she will introduce our two experts. Anne, over to you.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Welcome everybody to today's launch event from my side also. I'd now like to introduce to you Natasha Santos. Natasha, and welcome her up on stage. Natasha is an accomplished senior public affairs executive with over 17 years of experience in the agriculture, food, and life science industries. Natasha is the head of global stakeholder affairs and strategic partnerships at Bayer AG. She and her team are accountable for building and leveraging transformational platforms, programs, and initiatives to deliver on the Sustainable Development Goals as a company and generate positive value to stakeholder groups and society at large. Natasha, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you.
Natasha, what is sustainable farming and how does it differ from today's technologies and practices?
Wow, big question. First of all, thank you so much for Swiss Re for inviting us here. It's a pleasure to be here in Switzerland, in Zurich, and it's a pleasure to be with people and to the ones that are following us online as well. So thank you. And that's a big question. I think what is sustainable farming and how it differs from today's practices? I think sustainable farming is really about more with less. Easy to say, it's a catchphrase, but it's the real story. So more with less, meaning thinking about the outcome of sustainable farming, meaning how can we manage farming using less inputs, and that's water, that is crop protection, that is fertilizer, less inputs with making sure that we don't forget about the main goal of farming, which is to produce food and to feed the world, right? But of course, there's environmental consequences and externalities of that. So the approach that we are taking, that we believe with sustainable farming, is the outcome approaching. How can we measure the outcomes of sustainable farming? That means climate smart practices, lower emissions, carbon practice, biodiversity, it means water management. So all those outcomes, but making sure that we're using less inputs and more precise inputs. And then what is the accelerator to that? Is the famous digital revolution, is the famous digital farming. I think data science will help with farm management, will help with precise decision-making of farmers, and that will help us to have the credibility, measure those outcomes, and of course, more important, make sure that the farmers are profitable, because farming is about livelihoods as well.
Yeah. Thank you, Natasha. And as you mentioned, doing more with less and the importance of the different elements here, what do you see as specific opportunities and challenges that come with that move to more sustainable farming, and especially what do you see as impacts on the farmers?
Yeah, now that's a great question. So opportunities, I think, is the data science, right? And data science here looking at big farmers, which have specific pain points and have specific capabilities and scale, or smallholder farmers, and I'll talk about it in a second. But data science helping, as I mentioned at the beginning, decision-making, helping them to measure the way they use the inputs, the vision of sustainable farming, and the vision of that opportunity is, for example, when the farmer can precisely, let's think about a cornfield, which is huge, they can precisely and on real time, using data science, satellites, using digital farming, they can look at their fields and think about the better hybrid, and think about where in their huge hectares, in their huge fields, they should apply 1 drop, maybe 2 drops of crop protection, where actually the weed pressure or the disease pressure is compromising their farming. So I think the opportunity, it is better decision making, it is data science, it is more technology for farmers. Maybe another piece of opportunity is those disruptive technologies, things like biologics, things like one of our investment arm, our capital investment arm at Bayer called Leaps for Bayer. We invest in a company called Endis. I know you guys have mentioned on the reports as well, which look at how we can activate bacteria to help with carbon capture and as well to help with nutrient management of the plant. The bacteria will colonize the roots, and then that can really help to reduce fertilizer use. But is this profitable? How can they use it? Does the farmer know how to use it? There's a lot of risk associated when you change technologies, but those disruptive technologies are the only way we're going to accelerate change, and we're going to get to the sustainable farming and the share goals that we have in farming. So I think that is an opportunity. Then I think the challenge is not my field of expertise, it's yours, is the risk management, because the farmers can only do and work with us and contribute to the society from a food security point of view now with the war, but they can only do that transition if the risk is managed. So how can we quantify that risk, and how can we give them the tools in terms of loans, in terms of insurance, that will help them to do that transition, that will help them to have access to innovation, and that will help them to the number one thing that they cannot afford is to lose profitability in the process. So how can we do that together through collaboration? How can we offer them the tools that will help them do that?
Thanks so much, Natasha. I was going to ask you how you think the insurance industry can help, but I think you already pointed on a few important drivers here. And I think from our perspective, really it's insurance and the insurance products that help reduce the income volatility, which is a key concern for farmers, right? And so that's particularly driven by weather risks in the connection of climate change, even more exacerbated. And so if through insurance we can help farmers have more certainty of income, then we can give them more confidence to change the farming practices and make these long-term investments into new approaches. So I think that's where in a partnership across the value chain, we on the insurance and reinsurance side really come in. Maybe one of the risks we discussed in our interview with Frank Terhorst from Bayer was the need for us to reach more smallholder farmers around the world with technology that you also mentioned. So by their nature, they're hard to reach and often do not have the resources to pay for innovation. So what are your thoughts on how can we overcome this?
Yeah, that's the question. I think, and I'll sound like a broken record, but it's about data aggregation, it's about digital farming, it's about creating those tools for smallholders. So a few examples which we are working on in Africa, for example, in Kenya, we are working with a local startup that aggregates small farms into bigger plots. And they work with the farmers and they use the data, the decision making, how they access inputs to find a way to create those low costs, not only to find a way for them to access and reach those distributors, but create some low cost tools for them. In this case, it's fruits and vegetables. The same way that we are working with rice farmers in India, thinking about carbon farming and thinking about climate change. We all know that rice actually has a huge potential from a reduction of GHG emission, particularly because rice is one of the number one emitter of methane. That happens because it's paddy rice, it's flooded rice, and then the bacteria emits methane. So there's a huge opportunity to reduce that emission and contribute directly with climate resilience and climate change. But to do that, we have the protocols, but to do that, we need collaboration because we need to create the market ecosystem for the smallholders in a way that we gather the data that they can, for example, through their phone, access inputs, access insurance opportunities as well. We gather the data, we help them with capacity building, with training, with access to technology, but then as well we help them to access the market, international or local, and we help them to measure those outcomes, in this case, for example, reduction of methane emission, and then working with the value chain, working with the finance market is the only way we're going to be able to deliver those tools to the smallholders. So I think it's data aggregation, capacity building, and make sure that they have access to those technologies wherever they are.
Yeah, and then building on that, Natasha, I think from an insurance perspective, again, for us, the fact that this data is being gathered, that the fact that this data is then being made available, that helps us build innovative insurance solutions, index-based, where the remuneration is then paid out very, very quickly, and the whole scheme is just very, very lean. And we are actively working with governments to support insurance programs based on that new data to just make sure that this most vulnerable segment of the farming community becomes more self-sufficient. So that maybe leads us to another related area, which is the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So farming, much like many other sectors, will also need to demonstrate alignment to those goals. Plus, the sector will also have to comply with carbon farming certifications and food labeling initiatives, all while transitioning to a more sustainable, regenerative, and climate-smart range of practices. Can you talk more about some of the activities that are underway in that space, please?
For sure. One, we are working together, but I'll mention two. So, carbon farming. We have been working in Europe. Well, I think as we mentioned, and you talk a little bit about data science, the main challenge in sustainable ag, in measuring those outcomes, is data, of course, but as well how we balance standardization with the local approach, with the flexibility of having the local approach. So outcomes, the main outcomes in India rice, here I mentioned about methane, are different than the outcomes, or slightly, the trade-offs are slightly different than the outcomes we would expect in soybean in Brazil. Forest management, offsetting the cost of maintaining, the forest surplus for Brazilian soybean. It's not the same for rice India, where methane has such a big role to play in sustainable farming in that part of the world. So with that challenges of how we create the protocols, how we measure, how we think about standards, one example that we can only do through collaboration. Then one concrete example of action that we have taken together with Swiss Re in this case was looking at Europe, thinking about how we collectively, through collaboration, can accelerate carbon farming in Europe. So we launched last year, actually the report was a few months ago, the Carbon Farming Coalition. And we have players in all segments, from input to insurance to value chain players to food companies. And we are working in several initiatives. And those initiatives are more than a sum of its parts, because the initiatives need to go together, because you can only insure something if we have the data and we know what the challenges on the ground. So the work of this coalition is looking at how can we have initiatives to overcome the barriers for adoption of climate smart practices. And there are basic things like awareness raising. Farmers in Europe don't understand or don't see the value yet of climate smart practices because they are afraid of the risks of changing practices. So we are thinking about initiatives on barriers, how to overcome those barriers, and then more importantly, or as important, initiatives to scale on the ground, scale on farms. So we are thinking about pilots, and we are working in Spain and Germany to really have some of those activities on the farm towards regenerative agriculture and towards climate smart farming in Europe. So we can only do that when we have those experts together thinking about the solutions that they can bring to the farmers. Two things that really caught my attention on this initiative. One was farmers in Europe are not utilizing digital tools as much as maybe who is not closer to farming would expect. And second, they feel that the value of sustainable farming is more of a consumer-driven than actually helping their profitability. So the awareness raising, the agronomic understanding, the farm management understanding will be a key initiative in this endeavor. So looking forward and happy to be partnering with Swiss on that one. And then in the same direction, but looking at soil health that can help with carbon sequestration, we have as well an initiative in the Americas looking at living soils, which focus at the beginning in smallholders in Latin America, but we will expand as well for corn and soy. So the message is we can only move forward with collaboration. Bayer cannot do it alone, and we need to have that value chain collaboration to really accelerate and give the farmers the tools that they need.
Thank you, Natasha. I think we can really feel the passion and the enthusiasm and just the real depth and breadth of your experience. From Swiss Re side, also members of the Carbon Farming Coalition, we're really looking forward to the continued collaboration in that forum and the collaboration with Bayer and other members of this initiative to drive change. So thank you.
Thank you.
I'm now very pleased to introduce our next topic of quantum computing, and I'm very pleased to introduce our expert on the topic, Felipe Beato. Felipe is a cyber resilience and digital professional with a focus on strategy, transformation, and innovation on public-private sectors, and he currently leads the critical infrastructure protection and the quantum security projects at the World Economic Forum. And perhaps that tells us something already. Felipe, welcome.
Thank you. I'd like to thank you, Anne, for being here, for everyone at Swiss Re to being invited. Very happy to be here at the event and very happy to share my thoughts. It's going to be a quite hard transition for something very tangible on the sustaining farming thing, that's topic now, to something that is still undergoing, but I'll try to make my best to go from the technical sides to more verbatim sides, try to put in layman terms.
Super. Looking forward, Felipe. So first of all, how far have we come with quantum computing to date, and what are the next developments that we can anticipate?
So quantum computing is nothing new. So there's a lot of things on quantum. Quantum mechanics have been developed in the initial 20th century, like by building lasers, by building a lot of things that we're used today on quantum sensing. However, quantum computing is a new thing. It's a native technology. It's very nascent. And what is it, in very easy terms, is quantum computing is a new computational way of doing computation. So what they try to do is using quantum states. And what does this give compared to a normal computer is, instead of using zeros and ones that classical computers gives, it allows us to do multiple computations in parallel using these quantum states, using the qubits. And this, as you can expect, unlocks a lot of opportunities, specifically allows us to improve and to solve any complex problems that are not solved today. And then you can see a lot of advantage of it. It says it can improve optimization techniques in multiple processes in industries. It can allow us to simulate more effectively, but also allow us to work on the cryptography space and secure a little bit better. So there's a lot of space on quantum that opens a lot of opportunities, but also brings some new emerging risks.
So it sounds like a really interesting perspective also for the underwriting side, right? With potential big possibilities on our abilities to simulate, on our abilities to forecast and to just make use of the vast range of data in agriculture and elsewhere that's more and more compiled. So maybe Felipe, switching to one of the big concerns that one sees about quantum computing is that it represents a significant challenge to the existing encryption technologies that protect everything today, from our bank accounts to blockchains. So what does quantum computing mean for people and the technology we use in our daily lives? And alongside that, what do you think the insured risks are for individuals?
So that's actually one of the topics that is more tangible. So if there is still an uncertain timeline at the moment, because some experts put between 5 to 15 years, some others within 10 years, and some other experts say quantum will be here, and you can actually, all the potential in quantum, within 10 years, there's even deadlines and then timelines, and there's the year to quantum put by some experts as a clock counting down. So that's interesting. But the one thing that's very important is quantum will break the cryptography, or the public key cryptography that's used in our daily lives. So the RSA, the ECCs that we use for all the process we do personally. We use it on our bank accounts, on our WhatsApps and messaging to secure our communications. And companies rely with all the digitalization to secure their data. And if you can break it, then the exposition might be quite large, might block not only the operation of organizations, but also my access to data. And there's a concept, if you take, I'll touch on blockchain, but also touch on data, sensitive data. So I know insurance companies need to rely to stay about 6 years with sensitive data they have to storage. So that means that if quantum comes now, and if you start keeping the data, you start to store, and then decrypt later. So you have access, and the potential impact in terms of reputation of organization at Swiss Re, but also the impact for your clients is actually large. And this is one of the things. In terms of blockchain, yes, so blockchain, all the basis of blockchain is do this public key cryptography used, and there's a problem with it. There's at risk. And if you look at, there's some studies that made a comparison of potential risk if it happens now with either different attacks that are storage attacks or shard attacks. What happens is there's a potential of Bitcoin and Ethereum to have a $200 million impact on each about it. It's just to see this, its impact in terms of financial is quite large, and it might represent how can actually, in such a volatile market, can have actually impact as well the value of the Bitcoin. If that answers your question.
Well, it makes me a little worried, Felipe, to be honest. So you already touched a little bit on it, but maybe I can add another question around it. So we have that enormous strategic impact on quantum computing, and you talked about the need to protect not only the data itself, but also the sort of infrastructure around it, so we can still access it. If we then think about potential for targeted attacks on quantum research and quantum development, organizations. How do you see the risks around that?
I think the risks, besides all the risks that comes, I think the quantum, the good news is we're still working on quantum. So the risks are still at some time frame, that not now, but there's an opportunity to start working now to prepare, right? So there's three things that we try to do at the forum is like to create awareness, to try to understand and educate what is really quantum, and then three, try to start preparing. And one message that we actually got from all our communities is that we need to do it in collaboration with public and private, and we need to do it starting now. I think we have the opportunity to be prepared, and I think Patrick also mentioned one of the points that is very important is that can we actually be better prepared? And we have the opportunity now, so the good news is there's actions happening now to actually improve the vulnerable cryptography that's in. So NIST, when quantum started to be announced, NIST with the US, the National Institute of Standards, brought in the experts community to actually redevelop and repropose new algorithms. And those in 3 years' time we'll get it. And in 2 weeks, we have the 2 finalists that start to be shaped into standards. So there is actions already now to be taken, but we need to make it starting now, and you need to collaborate and then do it together.
Yeah. So Philippe, if I understand correctly, this is very much about the standard setting and about so having the basis for things like quantum safe cryptography, right, and for making that available. Can you talk a little bit about the outlook for standardization and how you think that will impact the overall landscape?
So standardization is a large topic, right? So so in terms of the algorithm side, so NIST is coming up with public key cryptography that's safe against the quantum attacks, like the Shor algorithms that's able to basically factorize prime numbers, which is all the cryptography relies on. So a hard problem, mathematical problem, quantum computing allows us to break and work on complex mathematical problems that you cannot work on today. So that put together can actually break the encryption. So how can I actually put now the correct standards to enforce it? Now there's the question that companies need to act now. And I looked at a couple of benchmarkings and studies and surveys, and the results are between 4 to 10% of the companies worldwide are actually start doing something at the education level or testing or pilot. So that's not that much. So I think the message is it's urgent to start now, because a transition from a quantum non-safe quantum environment to a quantum safe to update an infrastructure takes many years. If you take the experience of all the migrations that organizations go through, and most organizations have to keep either by regulatory measures or by cost-saving approach their legacy products, when transferring to new technologies takes a long time. So we need to start acting a little bit faster.
Yeah, that's certainly a call for action.
Yes.
If I sort of look around at the other frontier technologies that are at the moment talked about and invested into, of course, AI comes to mind, artificial intelligence. And I was just wondering if you could expand a little bit on the potential ultimate capabilities of quantum computing if it's paired with other emerging technologies such as artificial intelligence.
I think it is. I think it's important to see that quantum is another just gives you the tools to use it and to amplify a little of the problems that you have lacking to solve, to give the opportunity to solve new problems. I think what is very important is that nowadays, and I think we see a potential of, and some companies, you see the investments around it, there's a potential of moving from a digital economy today to a quantum economy. What does it mean is that this becomes a computation foundation that you can actually rely and use as a tool to, one, use AI to learn a little bit more, to simulate more information, to simulate the market, how is it evolving, to a little bit more accurate and faster. But also use it with AI to get a little bit more, if you pair with it, you can have improved capabilities. But it's also important to see that compared to AI, you can get a lot of lessons learned from AI in terms of the governance, the regulation, and all those things that came a little bit later with AI, to look forward and learn from the AI potential that is now and being used. How can you actually learn from that and use to unlock the potential that is predicted on quantum market? Like there's a potential of getting $1 trillion market only on quantum. So this is a lot. Like I think I discussed, this is about 20% of the full insurance market size. So there's a large potential, but how can you do that well from the start? By establishing the governance, by establishing, like, preparing well with the frameworks that are global enough and the standards that you mentioned.
Yeah. Thank you. So it sounds like a lot of cross-fertilization between those different technologies, and possibly also quantum computing being a bit of an amplifier, right? Being a mechanism to actually turbocharge some of the other developments that we see. So maybe as a last question, if I may, I'd like to flip a bit the focus to the people and the social side. So if we look at quantum computing, it's a hugely specialized technology. Very few people, I think, truly understand it. So we have enormous power concentrated in the hands of very, very few individuals, companies, or countries. So how do you see governments and regulation reacting to this rapid emergence and to that concentration of power?
So if you see, I think governments are already acting on it. I think the US government made the statement, or 2 statements, on quantum. We need to be quantum ready by 2035. I think the Netherlands are also doing work in regulation, and you have China investments a lot. So if you look at, especially in the public-private differences, there's about 24 billion invested on public investments, with China leading the way, and then Europe second. And then you do have then the private investments that skyrocketed a little bit for the past years, and that's about 4 billion for the past 3 to 4 years. So there's a difference. So that shows a little bit and demonstrates governments are taking the step. There's some experts that call it a race to quantum, to get who's getting there first, get the first mover's advantage. So they're doing something. And there's also a lot of collaboration. Some of the Western states actually came in a couple of weeks back, or a month back, together. There were 12 about nation states to collaborate and share knowledge on the quantum and share their expertise based on universities, on talent and skills, to actually develop the topic further.
So quite something, some activity that's going on. Well, certainly an emerging area, some emerging risks associated with it. Felipe, many thanks for these indeed fascinating insights into quantum computing and its implications for insurers and also for the wider public. Anthony, back over to you.
Thank you.
Very much indeed, Anna, and thank you very much also to Felipe and Natasha for the insights. Natasha, we've got some questions for you and Felipe, if we could come to those now. And I think what we'll do is we'll start asking questions in the room itself. So if any of you in the room do have a question, please put your hand up, and we'd be happy to ask that. And we've already got a few lined up online. Just to remind you that if you're online and you would like to ask a question, please just click on the icon on the top of the Microsoft Teams program there, and you will be able to ask your question. They are moderated, so it'll just take a moment or two to come through. But please do come on with your questions now. First one in the room, Rolf.
Thank you very much. Is it working? Thank you very much for these presentations. I think very insightful. I enjoyed it very much. My question would be to Natasha about sustainable farming. The world is producing enough food, but this food is produced in a few places and then transported to all the other places where it's consumed. So we see that now currently with the current situation. So in the 60s, the Green Revolution had this idea of raising production of foodstuff while simultaneously improving the self-sufficiency of poorer countries. And while they succeeded on raising production, obviously it has failed on achieving self-sufficiency for a lot of poor countries. So my question would be, when I heard you talking about the sustainable farming, I see some parallels with the Green Revolution, you know. So how can we make sure that this time we do better on achieving self-sufficiency?
Thank you. Yes, so first of all, I believe in technology, all types of technologies. But answering your question, completely agree. I think the challenge that we have now is, to your point, how we make sure that the food gets to who it needs. There is a few assessments. First of all, we need to produce food where it's more environmental friendly and where it's needed, first of all. Second, we need to make sure that the food reaches who needs the food, right? All of us. I think particularly in low and middle income countries, there's a few areas of challenge. One is basic infrastructure. If you look at Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, for example, has the less road density in the world. So we need to invest that for food production and for food availability. Another opportunity here, which we have been investing in, is very important for environmental sustainability, but as well for circular economy, which is crop rotation and local varieties. We have the opportunity, even if we look at the 6 big crops, we have opportunities, and I'll look again at Africa, but in Latin America and in Asia, we have opportunities to use those stable crops or the 6 big crops, use local crops, use hybrids as part of the crop rotation. So we can simulate things like teff or things like, the teff is a good example because we're investing in Northern Africa, to have local varieties that can fulfill food needs and nutritional needs of that country. And those are local varieties that we can use on crop rotation, and then we can help, of course, and I'm not only looking at niche, we can help with the proper demand, with the value chain collaboration. We can help to pull those varieties or those crop opportunities to the basket of nutritional needs of specific countries. So that's how I envision to the future. Nevertheless, I think technology and looking at Africa, I think biotechnology, I think gene editing are going to continue to be a critical factor in productivity and as well helping availability of food. But I think if I capture the soul of your question, I think one thing that we haven't talked enough and we need to continue to talk more is how we can accelerate and how we can support those local varieties and those crops that are not the big stable one.
Thank you, Natasha. Felipe, there's one here for you, which is, while there are undoubtedly great possibilities associated with quantum technology computing in particular, there are still some open questions. We hear a lot about security and ethical issues, but what about issues of sustainability? Similar to blockchain, this technology requires, I assume, huge amounts of energy, cooling, for example. So how does that fit with a more sustainable future?
I think there's a good question and a little bit hard to answer on the sense that how can you actually now, if the quantum is not yet here, a full quantum computer, how can you actually analyze how much energy consumption it does, how much sustainable it is? I think there is hypothesis running that they're not data points that are, they don't deliver the data points that are correctly enough for us to take a perspective of this. But one thing that might be important to think is not yet here. We will rely on energy. So can we actually take the time from today to actually use this energy transition flow and the transition from carbon fossil fuels to zero carbon neutral that we are aiming to by 2030, and given that the expectation of quantum will be after 2030, get that lessons learned and apply these learnings to use and profit to reduce a little bit the emissions of quantum computing. And the other thing that might be important is, given that quantum is being a little bit more focused on cloud native design, we have the opportunity to maybe have single quantum computers rather than multiple ones, like we have every day by producing by classical computers in our watches, smartphones, and so on and so forth.
Okay, thank you, Felipe. The next question is a good one here, Natasha. Bayer produces agricultural chemicals, so how does doing more with less benefit you as a commercial enterprise?
Love the question. So Bayer portfolio is seeds and traits, agrochemicals, biologicals, and digital solutions. And we provide that to farmers, conventional, organic, all types of farmers. More with less, it's about the vision that we have, and that actually we are applying today, because farmers wants to be, we all know, wants to be profitable, and they are very proud of feeding the world. And then looking at being only a product provider, it's the agribusiness of, 20 years ago. What we are looking at, it is to be a service provider. So it's a package. It's creating tailored solutions that can help the farmer, of course, deal with their pain points, which is weed management, disease management, pest management, which is important, it's huge, it's very complicated. It can destroy their whole harvest. So we need to continue to help them with that, with disruptive technology, with conventional technology. But the vision is more with less. So our vision of the future with the digital tools is, can they apply, they should apply one drop in one plot of their farm. We're not volume driven, we're service driven. So that's the more with less strategy approach and business approach for Bayer moving forward, and I think for all the agribusiness moving forward.
Thank you, Natasha. Next one, Felipe, for you. There are a number of industries, there are a number of countries who are developing quantum technologies. Who are the most advanced, and what is the point at which this starts becoming meaningful advances, really that we can use in a meaningful way?
So in terms of countries, it's a little bit hard to say who's advanced or not advanced. I think there's a lot of confidential information running on at the government side of things. Like I mentioned, there's definitely a quantum race per se between countries, but there's different focus areas. I think if you look, there's a large investment in China. I think, let me see if I have the numbers, but it's about 15 to 16 billion a year. Like this has been the public investment on China, and they've been focused on the communication spec. So instead, they really focus on how communicate and establish infrastructure on communication that's based on quantum, by setting the satellites, by setting antennas like this one's on a screen, and then having a communication through quantum state. While Western countries are a little bit more in a quantum computing way. What's the opportunity you have? How can you harness and build the quantum computers that you can use? By when, I think we need to wait until it materializes. I think like I will use the experts' timeline they're putting, and a lot of putting between 5 to 15 years, maybe within 10 years. There will be maybe a timeline to take into account. That's when we're expecting to have quantum computers that are relevant to use and to harness for all the applications.
Okay.
Hopefully.
Gives us a little bit of time, Anne.
It does, luckily.
Patrick, a question has come in for you from Paul Walsh. What would you consider the most critical emerging risk for insurers? And also, could you please give more examples of what you consider to be long-term developing risks?
Thank you for the question. So the most critical risk is really just, it is always a question it depends on when the question is being answered. So it's certainly not the purpose of the emerging risk thinking is to answer the question sort of on the spot. Obviously, if you just ask me today, topics that we talk a lot about right now are inflation. Obviously, we mentioned the war. There are current topics. So it's almost I almost challenge a bit the question in the context of emerging risk, which is why I'd probably like to give a few other examples on slow burning. That's, I mentioned climate change. I think another one which I think is being spoken about it, but I personally view it as very relevant, is sort of the accumulation of toxins in the natural environment through the food chain. But there's also more almost well-known ones that have a tendency to then disappear from public discourse. So, for example, aging and the burden it puts on social systems, on fiscal viability of countries. It tends to appear and then disappear while from the public dialogue, while in reality it typically, so one defining moment for me was really during the financial crisis, when all the attention of fiscal politics was around saving, stabilizing the financial system, saving the banks. In the meantime, obviously, aging continued, and there was hardly any discussion about stabilizing or saving the social security systems. And they've become less funded, and also obviously the healthcare systems across the world have become less funded. So it's this concern that by focusing on what is currently burning, you sort of overlook other things which actually just are much worse, but they develop less spectacularly.
Thank you, Patrick. Natasha, I think one for you. So you mentioned that one of the key issues for agriculture in the future will be to do more with less. But it isn't also a change in the type of agriculture also needed, given that almost 80% of agricultural land is dedicated to livestock feed and grazing, ultimately for the production of rather calorie and protein inefficient foods that are also some of the main contributors to climate change. Shouldn't there also be a push towards a conversion of available land to produce more crops that humans actually eat, gradually reducing the share of land dedicated to feeding livestock?
Land management is one of the big challenges in agriculture. Let's look at the feed value chain. Maybe let's look at big crops like corn and soybean. Land management, as I mentioned on my first comments on the first question that Anne asked me, we need to look at the outcomes, right? So environmental sustainability is about the outcomes and how we measure those outcomes. Are we reducing emission? Are we capturing carbon? Are we managing biodiversity? Are we better managing water? So what we are really driven, and I think we should all do together, is to look at the outcomes and then think about what are the practices that help us to achieve those outcomes. This is the first piece I wanted to share. Then second, land management is important. Thinking about soybean in Brazil, how can we measure, quantify the value for a farmer to offset the costs of land management and keep the surplus of their forests, for example. I'm not talking about illegal deforestation. I'm Brazilian and illegal deforestation is criminal. We can talk maybe in another second, but I'm happy to talk about that. But I'm talking about forests, legal forests. How can we pay? We need to pay the farmer because the primary role is to produce food. That's the primary role. So how can we help the farmer to continue to be profitable and deliver those ecosystem services? And that's why we need the collaboration. We need to get together to think creatively how we offer tools that can compensate farmers for ecosystem service. How can we measure? How can that be transparent? And how can we have a public debate where those outcomes are transparent? I was with farmers this week, yesterday in Frankfurt, 28 farmers from all over the world, all sides, and they keep telling us they're so tired of being pointed that they are doing bad. They want to know how we can help them to show how can we help them to be better and to find opportunities to improve their farm management, and then how can they show transparently that they are being sustainable. So this is one message. And then the second, yes, disruptive technology, for example, plant-based meat, thinking about consumption, particularly in the northern hemisphere, because we still have a big protein gap in places like Asia, in places like Africa, and people need to access protein, needs to be low cost. And I think maybe that's what the Green Revolution did, to help food to be affordable. So how we think about disruptive technologies, cultivated meat, that will help us to lower the footprint of the food system, and then maybe in areas where people can afford, that can be a choice. So I think it's the collaboration, the value chain, all of us have a role to play here, but not forgetting that the farmers, they need to farm, they need to be profitable, is a business as well.
Thank you, Natasha. Yeah, and then I mean, one of the purposes, and Felipe, this is one for you. I mean, one of the purposes of SONAR really is, as Patrick said at the beginning, is to provoke discussion and to actually raise the issues. And I noticed that last week, Felipe, Gillian Tett, who's the chair of the editorial board in the US, I think she hosted the World Economic Forum session on quantum computing, wrote an excellent piece, as ever, about with her anthropological background, about this is not a topic that people really are talking about. I'm pleased that we're talking about it today, but how well are we doing on talking about it, and how can we increase the volume on this topic in particular?
Yeah, I'm very happy actually you brought it up. I think the piece was actually very interesting because one key point that she brought in is, there's actually two key points. The fact that if quantum comes, it breaks the encryption that we all rely on all our digital infrastructure. So that's a scare that risk, so everyone concerned, and impacts not only your normal daily lives, your bank accounts, your private information, but if you look at the digitalization of infrastructure, you might have a infrastructure background, so you just put in general, it can break down all the electricity grid, it can break down all the things that we rely on. The impact can be large. If you see that Zurich, for example, doesn't have a light for 1 or 2 days, it can be a very, very large impact. So the reason, one other point that Gillian brought up is the fact that it's a topic that is brought by the technical people up and is not well yet understood by senior leaders so far. I think there is an understanding that might be a bridge. I mean, one thing that we try at the forum is to really focus on not only understand and educate this, on not only the other point that I'm actually forgetting is the hype that's around the topic. There's a lot of hype that quantum will come and save carbon neutral, save sustainable farming. It will be the solution for everything. It's just one thing that we need to understand is quantum will give us the tools, a foundation, a baseline that we can actually use and combine to do correct simulations for carbon neutral, optimization of farming. It might help for that, but it's not going to save the world. And one thing it needs to be done is education, not only at the technical, but at the general education to people to understand what is quantum, what it really is, and what's really capable, and really debunk what's the hype around it, because I think there's a lot of hype. And that's one of the things I try to do. And also elevate the conversation for really explain what it is and abort the topic as a future topic that we need to focus now, rather than something that will save and be a saver or a hard problematic problem. Mm-hmm.
Important, but not then urgent in Patrick's parlance. Very good, Natasha. Perhaps I think we've got time for just one last question, just so briefly, if possible. With the Ukraine war firing up debates about food sovereignty and food security, what are your views about calls by some agricultural cooperatives to cultivate all available land to compensate for the blockage of food supply? Is that the right strategy?
Well, good question. I think the challenge that we have with the war is, of course, additional risks. Another risk in our list. We need to think I don't know if the right strategy is to cultivate in all the available land. We need to think about productivity. There are areas, first of all, we need to think about the war and be responsible and make sure that we are there for the Ukrainians now and in the future. But then look at other places of the world, particularly the ones that will be most affected, Northern Africa, East Africa, for example, and think about their own productivity. Are they productive? What are they? Do they have the crops that we can boost investment on for the nutritional basket in that country? And I think it's about productivity, and I think there is a gap. We need to close the yield gap on productivity in those places, and we can do with capacity building, we can do with the right tools. They need to access those technologies. So I would look at closing the yield gaps more than just thinking about planting in all the available land of the world. It's about productivity.
Thank you very much, Natasha. Great. Well, we've run out of time, I'm afraid. And these are just 2 of the 14 or so topics that we have in this year's SONAR under the 3 major themes. Thank you for joining us today, and thank you particularly to our speakers, Natasha Santos of Bayer and Felipe Beato from the World Economic Forum, and of course, thank you to you, Anna, and Patrick from Swiss Re for joining us today. The contents or this video will be available on the SONAR website, on the swissre.com website, and we will also be posting other content on there. There's already something there on thawing permafrost, and likely to be something up there on crypto in just the next day or 2. Obviously a huge topic at the moment. So thank you very much indeed to our speakers and to the audience for joining us, and those of you online, and please enjoy the SONAR content. Thanks. Goodbye for now.